The traffic stop lasted exactly 4 minutes, but it took me a lifetime to understand what happened in those 4 minutes. Officer Derek Paulson pulled me over on Maple Street for an air freshener hanging from my rearview mirror, a small, pine-scented tree that had been dangling there since my son Brandon bought it for me at a gas station 3 weeks earlier. I remember his words exactly. "Mom, the car smells like old coffee and regret, let's fix that." He'd laughed. I'd laughed. We put the air freshener up, and I never thought about it again until Derek's hand was on my window, and his voice was tight with the kind of authority that doesn't need justification. But what I didn't know then, what nobody knew, was that this stop would unravel everything my ex-husband Marcus had been hiding, expose the corruption that ran deeper than any of us could have imagined, and ultimately prove that the most powerful person in that squad car wasn't the one wearing the badge. Let me back up. Let me tell you who I was before that Tuesday afternoon in September, before everything shifted like tectonic plates. My name is Ashley Coleman. I'm 43 years old, and I live in a 3-bedroom colonial in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, about 20 minutes from downtown. The house isn't fancy. It's a 1998 build with original hardwood floors that creak in all the right places, a kitchen that was renovated sometime in the early 2000s, and a backyard where I've been trying unsuccessfully for 5 years to grow tomatoes. The neighborhood is quiet, the kind of place where people wave at each other from driveways, and the HOA actually sends you passive-aggressive letters about your lawn maintenance. I got one last June. I deserved it. I work as a paralegal at Hoffman & Associates, a mid-sized law firm downtown that handles everything from divorce settlements to corporate litigation. It's not glamorous, but it pays the mortgage, funds my 401k, and gives me something to do with the part of my brain that still enjoys solving puzzles. I've been there for 8 years. My boss, Richard Hoffman, is the kind of guy who remembers your birthday and asks about your kids, which in corporate America means he's either genuinely decent or terrifyingly manipulative. I'd always assumed decent. Brandon is 21 now. He finished his undergraduate degree at Portland State 2 years ago and went straight into law school, Columbia, full scholarship, which still feels like a fever dream when I say it out loud. He's brilliant. Not the kind of brilliant where he's socially awkward and lives in his head. He's the kind who can talk to anyone about anything and make you feel like your thoughts matter. He gets that from his father, though Marcus's version of charm had always come with a price tag attached. My daughter Nisha is 17. She's a senior at Lincoln High, captain of the debate team, and she's already been accepted to 4 colleges early decision. Unlike Brandon's easy brilliance, Nisha has to work for everything, and she does it without complaining. She has Marcus's eyes, but my stubbornness, which is a combination that doesn't apologize. The divorce happened 6 years ago. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was the slow kind of dissolution that happens when you realize the person you married isn't the person you're living with, and more importantly, he never intended to be. Marcus had been a pharmaceutical sales director, the kind of job that meant money came in regularly but explanations came in rarely. We met in college. He was handsome in that forgettable way, tall, confident, the kind of guy who looked good in a suit. We dated for 3 years, got married because it seemed like the next logical step, and had kids because that's what married people with stable jobs did. For a while it worked, or it looked like it worked. The distinction matters more than I understood at the time. The marriage started cracking around year 7, though I didn't recognize the sound of it breaking. Marcus began working longer hours. His phone became something he carried into bathrooms and bedrooms, always angled away from me. The conversations I overheard were vague, lots of, "We'll talk about this later," and "That's not something I can discuss at home." I told myself he was stressed. I told myself all husbands had secrets. I told myself I was being paranoid and jealous, and that was the real problem in our marriage. When I finally hired a divorce attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Chen who charged $350 an hour and didn't blink when I asked if that was negotiable, the discovery process revealed that Marcus had been siphoning money. Not dramatically, nothing that would trigger alerts, just small transfers to accounts in his name, moving money around like a magician's hands. Enough that when we did the settlement, I walked away with the house, primary custody, and a deep distrust of men who wore expensive watches and said, "I love you," while looking at their phones. The last 6 years had been good, though. Healing. Normal. I'd rebuilt a life that was small enough to fit in my hands and large enough to feel full. Monday mornings, I made coffee in my kitchen and listened to NPR while I got ready for work. Weekends, I'd sometimes have Brandon home from law school, and we'd cook together. Nothing elaborate, just pasta or roasted chicken, and he'd tell me about cases he was studying and professors he found fascinating. Nisha and I had established a Thursday night tradition, Thai food from the place on Morrison Street, and we'd sit at the kitchen table and she'd tell me about whatever drama was happening in her debate competitions or her friend group. It was domestic. It was safe. It was the life I'd chosen to build after the life I'd been given fell apart. The air freshener was still hanging from my mirror that Tuesday afternoon. I remember exactly what I was wearing: dark jeans, a cream-colored sweater from Target, and the brown ankle boots I'd bought on sale. I remember that I'd been thinking about dinner, whether to defrost chicken or order something, when I saw the lights in my rearview mirror. I remember the exact thought I had. Oh God, how fast was I going? Officer Derek Paulson approached the driver's side window with the kind of purposefulness that suggested he already knew what he was looking for. He was maybe mid-40s, built like someone who took his gym time seriously, with the particular expression of controlled aggression that some cops wear like a uniform within the uniform. He didn't smile. He didn't offer the standard pleasantries that most traffic stops begin with. "License and registration," he said, and his eyes went straight to the air freshener. I watched him look at it, really look at it, and then look back at me with something I couldn't immediately identify. Contempt? Amusement? Something else entirely. I handed him my documents. My hands weren't shaking, not yet. I was annoyed more than anything. An air freshener violation seemed absurd, the kind of thing that got dismissed in traffic court. I'd been pulled over maybe 3 times in my life. I'd never gotten a ticket that stuck. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made the back of my neck tighten. "The air freshener?" I said. It came out as a question. "Oregon Revised Statute 815.320, he said. "Obstructed view. It's the law, Miss Coleman. Maybe you're not familiar with it." I wasn't familiar with it. I'd never heard of it. And as he ran my license, which took an unusually long time, long enough that I started to feel a different kind of anxiety, the kind that comes when you realize something is wrong but you can't identify what, I realized that this wasn't about the air freshener at all. This was about something else. Something I didn't understand. Something that, when he came back to my window and his expression had shifted into something harder, more deliberate, made me understand that I was about to find out exactly how little I knew about the people in my life. "Your ex-husband," he said, and there was no preamble, no softness in his voice. "Marcus Coleman. You're still in contact with him?" My mouth went dry. That was not a question that belonged in a traffic stop. "Why are you asking me that?" I said, and my voice sounded smaller than I expected it to. Derek Paulson looked at me for a long moment. He had the kind of eyes that had seen things, or thought they had, or wanted you to believe they had. "You might want to ask your son what he's been doing with his time at Columbia," he said quietly. "You might want to ask him about his internship last summer." And that was when the world, which had felt so solid just moments before, began to shift beneath my feet. The next 3 hours were strange in a way that made me question whether I was actually awake or caught in one of those dreams where you're moving through water and everything is distorted. I drove home slowly, my hands steady on the wheel but my mind spinning through possibilities, rejections, and then possibilities again. What had Brandon done? What could Brandon have done? He was a law student. His internship last summer had been at some firm in New York. He'd come back to visit in August with stories about the city and the cases and the grueling hours. He hadn't mentioned anything that would warrant a traffic stop and a cryptic warning from a police officer who clearly knew something about my family that I didn't. When I got home, the house was empty. Nisha was at debate practice. I had 3 hours before she'd be back. I made tea and then poured it down the sink because I couldn't remember why I'd made it. I sat on the couch in the living room and stared at my phone. I thought about calling Brandon, but what would I say? "A cop pulled me over and implied you're involved in something illegal?" That seemed like the kind of conversation you don't have over the phone. I thought about calling Marcus. I hadn't spoken to him in probably 2 months. We had the kind of post-divorce relationship that was cordial but distant. We communicated through email mostly, about logistics and money, the mechanical necessities of sharing custody and a history. I didn't know what was happening in his life anymore. I didn't want to know, if I was being honest. He'd remarried 2 years ago to a woman named Stephanie who was exactly the kind of second wife you'd expect. Younger, blonder, seemingly incurious about where all his money came from. Instead, I did what people do when they're afraid. I opened my laptop and I started searching. I Googled Brandon's name. Nothing recent came up, just his Columbia Law profile and a few debate team notices from his undergraduate years. I Googled Marcus. Nothing jumped out. The pharmaceutical company he'd worked for had downsized him out 3 years ago, and since then I'd only known that he had some kind of consulting position, something vague and lucrative. He paid his child support on time. He sent birthday gifts. Beyond that, I'd deliberately not paid attention. I was still sitting there, laptop open, when my phone rang. It was Brandon. "Hey, Mom," he said, and his voice had that particular quality it got when he was calling from somewhere loud, somewhere he had to speak up a little. "How's your day?" My heart was hammering. "Brandon, I need to ask you something." There was a pause. It was very short, maybe a quarter of a second, but I heard it. "Okay," he said carefully. "What's up? Did something happen last summer? With your internship? Something that a police officer would know about?" Another pause. This one was longer. "Where is this coming from?" he asked, and his voice had changed. The casual warmth had drained out of it. "A cop pulled me over today. He knew who I was. He knew who your father is. He made some kind of comment about your internship, and I need to know what he was talking about." I heard him exhale. It sounded like a decision being made. "Mom, I can't talk about this on the phone. Are you home right now?" "Yes, but..." "I'm going to call you back in 5 minutes from my apartment. Don't leave. Don't call Dad. Don't call anyone. Just stay there and wait for me to call you back." He hung up before I could respond. Those 5 minutes were the longest 5 minutes of my life. I sat on the couch, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic on the street, the absolute silence of a house that suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. I thought about all the moments I'd missed, all the things I hadn't asked, all the ways I'd convinced myself that my children's lives were simple enough that I didn't need to dig too deeply into the details. I thought about the air freshener still hanging from my car mirror, and how something so small and so meaningless had been the key that unlocked a door I didn't know was closed. When my phone rang again, I answered immediately. "Hi, Mom," Brandon said, and he was in his apartment now, somewhere quiet. I could hear the careful precision in his voice, the way he was choosing each word. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen all the way through before you react, okay?" "Okay," I whispered. "Last summer my internship wasn't actually at a law firm," he said. "It was with the FBI. I was working in their white-collar crime division, doing research and document analysis on a case. The case involved pharmaceutical companies and pricing fraud. And Dad is apparently involved in that case. He's been involved for a while. And I didn't know he was involved when I took the internship. I didn't find out until I was already there, and then I had to recuse myself from anything directly related to him. But the thing is, Mom, the thing that matters is..." He stopped. I heard him take a breath. "Officer Paulson is a detective with the Portland Police Department, and he's been assigned to the task force investigating this. And if he's pulling you over and asking about Dad, that means the investigation is moving into a phase where they're going to start looking at family members. And that means something big is about to happen." I opened my mouth. I closed it. I opened it again. "What kind of something?" I asked. "The kind where Dad might be arrested," Brandon said quietly. "The kind where everything gets turned upside down. The kind where I should probably have told you about this a long time ago, and I'm sorry I didn't." And that was when I understood that the air freshener hanging from my mirror had always been a symbol of something deeper. It was the small thing that caught the light at exactly the right angle, the thing that made the cop look twice, the thing that led him to pull over the ex-wife of a man who had apparently been committing federal crimes for years, while I was busy building a normal life and pretending that normal lives didn't require constant vigilance. The phone was still pressed to my ear. Brandon was waiting for me to say something. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. Nisha would be home in an hour. Marcus was somewhere in this city, probably at home with Stephanie, probably unaware that the walls were finally closing in. "Tell me everything," I said to my son. "Tell me everything and don't leave anything out." Acts 3 to 8. The collision, escalation, the bottom, the turn, retribution, and resolution. Brandon's voice was steady, but I could hear the weight of it, the burden he'd been carrying alone for months. He told me everything. How he'd realized mid-internship that his father's consulting work was actually a front. How Marcus had been directing pricing schemes for a major pharmaceutical company, inflating costs on life-saving drugs by 300%. How the FBI had been building a case for 18 months. How Brandon had sat in a conference room with federal agents who showed him documents with his father's signature, his father's emails, his father's very careful language designed to hide culpability while maximizing profit. "The worst part," Brandon said, and his voice cracked slightly, "is that he knew I was interning with them. He asked me about it. And I think he was testing me, seeing if I would tell him what I knew, seeing if I would warn him." I couldn't speak. My mouth had gone dry, my throat constricted with a feeling I didn't have a name for. Betrayal wasn't the right word. It was bigger than that. It was the entire foundation of my life, the divorce settlement, the child support, the reasonable explanation for why he'd suddenly become less involved in the kids' lives after we split. It was all built on a lie. Or rather, built around a truth I'd never suspected. "Mom," Brandon said, "are you there?" "I'm here," I whispered. I need you to tell me what happens next. What does the FBI do? When do they arrest him?" "Soon," Brandon said. "That's what Detective Paulson was trying to tell you. The task force is moving into the final phase. They're building leverage, and part of that leverage is going to be your cooperation." My cooperation. The words hung in the air between us, suspended like a held breath. I was supposed to do something. I was supposed to be part of this, and nobody had asked me if I wanted to be. "What do you mean, my cooperation?" I asked, and I could hear the tremor in my own voice now. "They want to know if you have access to any financial records, if Marcus ever kept documents at the house, if you know anything about accounts, transfers, communications with people from the company. They want to know if you'll testify to what you know about his behavior, his lies about where his money was coming from, anything that establishes a pattern of deception." I thought about the divorce proceedings. I thought about the documents I'd reviewed with Linda Chen, the careful way Marcus's income had been declared and then somehow justified as consulting fees that were vague enough to raise questions, but specific enough to seem legitimate. I thought about a conversation I'd overheard once, years ago, when he was on the phone in the garage and didn't know I was there. "The margins are too thin if we don't push the narrative," he'd said. I'd assumed he was talking about his sales numbers. I'd never questioned it. "Okay," I said, and the word came out smaller than I meant it to. "Okay, I'll talk to them. I'll help." "Mom," Brandon started, but I cut him off. "No, it's fine. It's the right thing to do. And if your father did this, if he actually did what they're saying he did, then people got hurt. People who couldn't afford these drugs got hurt. And I can't be part of protecting that. I won't be." I heard him exhale on the other end of the line, a sound of relief mixed with something else. Guilt, maybe. Or sadness for the man we'd both thought we knew. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something I didn't tell you yet." Of course there was. There was always something else. "What?" I asked, bracing myself. "Detective Paulson called me yesterday. He wanted to know if there were any indications that Dad had been trying to hide assets. He asked if I knew anything about offshore accounts, shell companies, anything like that. And Mom, I don't know if this means anything, but last year, when I was home for winter break, I saw a credit card bill on the kitchen counter. It was for a company I'd never heard of, Meridian Holdings. And the statement showed recurring charges, like $50,000 a month going to something called consulting services. I closed my eyes. Meridian Holdings. I tried to search my memory for any reference to that name, any conversation Marcus had had that I'd overheard, any hint of what it might be. Nothing came, which meant either he'd been very careful or I'd been very deliberately not paying attention. "Did you tell Detective Paulson?" I asked. "I did. He said it was helpful. He said they already knew about Meridian, but they were building a timeline, and anything I could provide that showed Dad's pattern of concealment was useful. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my living room for a very long time. The house was quiet in that particular way houses are quiet when you're waiting for something terrible. The refrigerator hummed its constant, meaningless song. Outside, a car passed on the street, headlights cutting across the living room wall. I thought about Marcus in our bed, holding my hand while we watched movies. I thought about him teaching Nisha how to parallel park. I thought about him at Brandon's high school graduation, proud and beaming, the picture of a good father. And I thought about all of those moments being built on a foundation of lies so effed over, so calculated, that they required federal law enforcement to unravel. Nisha came home at 7 o'clock, and I'd managed to compose myself enough to pretend everything was normal. She was flushed from debate practice, animated about some tournament coming up, and I made her a snack and listened while she talked, my mind in a completely different place. I didn't tell her anything. It wasn't my place. That conversation would come from law enforcement, from her father's lawyer, from the machinery of justice that was slowly grinding into motion. But I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I thought about the air freshener hanging from my mirror. How something so small, so utterly meaningless, had been the key that opened a door I didn't know existed. I thought about Derek Paulson, who I'd resented for stopping me, for his cryptic warnings, for his intrusion into my ordered life. He'd been trying to tell me something. He'd been trying to prepare me. At 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and went to the office, the small room off the kitchen where I kept my files. I pulled out the folders from the divorce proceedings. I read through documents I hadn't looked at in years. And there it was, buried in the financial disclosures, a reference to consulting income from a company called Meridian Holdings. Just a line item, easily dismissed. The kind of thing that Linda Chen and I had gone over quickly because it all seemed legitimate on the surface. I sat at the desk with my fingers shaking, and I pulled out my phone, and I called Detective Derek Paulson. His voicemail picked up immediately, which meant he'd recorded a greeting at some point but never checked messages. I left my own message, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ashley Coleman," I said. "You pulled me over today. I want to meet with you. I want to help with the investigation, and I think I have some documents that might be relevant." I hung up and I sat there, and I understood that I had just crossed a line. Not a moral one. I was on the right side of this. But a line nonetheless. The moment you decide to testify against someone, even someone you've loved, even someone you've built a life with, something fundamental shifts. You can't unknow what you know. You can't pretend anymore. The phone rang at 6 in the morning. Derek Paulson. His voice was different on the phone. No longer the cop, but something more human. Something almost kind. "Miss Coleman," he said. "Thank you for calling. Can you meet with me today? I have a task force meeting at 10. We can talk before that." We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those places that looks like it was designed by someone who'd never actually been to a coffee shop, but had read about them in a magazine. Derek was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He stood when he saw me, and I noticed for the first time that he had kind eyes. I'd missed that before, in the stress of the traffic stop. I'd only seen the badge. "I want you to know," he said once we'd sat down, "that what you're doing today is important, and it's not easy, and we understand that." I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup and I told him everything. I told him about the offshore account references in the divorce documents. I told him about the credit card bill Brandon had seen. I told him about conversations I'd overheard, moments I'd dismissed as normal business talk, but which, in context, sounded different. I told him about the way Marcus's income had grown mysteriously after we got married, how it had accelerated after Brandon was born, how it had only slowed down when we started the divorce proceedings. "He was hiding it," I said. "Not dramatically. He was hiding it by making it visible but inexplicable, by burying the real information in layers of legitimate-looking documents." Derek took notes. He didn't interrupt. And when I was done, when I'd emptied out everything I knew and everything I suspected, he closed his notebook, and he looked at me with something that might have been compassion. "We're going to need you to testify," he said. "Not immediately, but soon." There will be a grand jury hearing and we'll need you to walk through the financial timeline. We'll also need you to sign some documents giving us permission to access the accounts you shared with your ex-husband during the marriage. Some of those accounts are still active, and there are transfers that need to be traced. Okay, I said, and the word felt like a vow. One more thing, Derek said. This is going to become public. When your ex-husband is arrested, his name will be in the news. Your kids' names might come up. And there's going to be a period where this is very difficult for your family. I want to prepare you for that. I nodded. I was already prepared, or as prepared as anyone could be for their ex-husband to become a federal crime story. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning. I was at work when my phone started buzzing. A news alert. Local pharmaceutical consultant arrested on federal fraud charges. Then another alert from a different news outlet. Then my phone started ringing. People from work who'd seen the news and wanted to make sure I was okay. People from my neighborhood who'd recognized the address. Linda Chen, my divorce attorney, calling to tell me she'd already fielded 3 calls from journalists. Richard Hoffman, my boss, called me into his office. He closed the door carefully behind me, and I prepared myself for the worst. Instead, he told me that my work on the Coleman file, the divorce discovery I'd done 6 years ago, had been requested by the federal prosecutors. They wanted to know if my analysis of the financial documents matched what they'd found. My work was going to be part of the case. Apparently, I'd been thorough enough to catch things that were important. You did good work, Richard said, and he meant it. And I want you to know that this firm supports you. If you need time off, if you need anything, you let me know. I didn't need time off. I needed to keep working, to keep moving, to keep my life as normal as possible while my children's world crumbled. Because that's what was happening. That's what Derek had tried to warn me about. Nisha found out about the arrest at school. Someone's parent had seen it on the news and mentioned it to their kid, and by third period, the whole school knew that Lincoln High's debate captain's father had been arrested for defrauding pharmaceutical companies. She called me at work, and she was crying, angry, confused all at once. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. "Why did I have to hear it from Hannah's mom?" "I didn't know how to tell you," I said, and it was the truth. "It only happened this morning. Well, everyone at school knows now, and they're looking at me like I'm some kind of criminal, like I knew about this and didn't say anything." "You didn't know," I said quietly, "and neither did I, not until a few days ago." "But you knew," she said. "You must have known something. Mom, he's your ex-husband. You were married to him for 11 years. The accusation in her voice, the implication that I should have known, that I should have caught this, that I should have protected her from it, landed like a punch. And maybe she was right. Maybe if I'd paid closer attention, if I'd been less willing to accept Marcus's explanations, if I'd questioned him harder about where his money was coming from, I would have known. But I hadn't, and I couldn't change that now. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it with every part of my being. "I'm so sorry, baby. I know this is hard. I know it feels like something I should have prevented. But I didn't know, and I can't change that." She hung up on me. Didn't say goodbye, didn't say she loved me. Just the sound of the line going dead. I sat at my desk with the phone pressed to my ear, and I felt something crack open inside me. This was the cost of truth. This was what happened when you did the right thing. Your daughter hung up on you. Brandon called later that night. He was in New York, in his apartment, and he'd already seen the news. He'd already gotten calls from classmates asking if his father really was a criminal. He'd already had to explain to people that yes, the man who raised him had apparently been siphoning money from sick people for years. "Are you okay?" he asked me, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "No," I said, "but I will be." "Are you?" "No," he said, "but I will be too." We didn't say much more. We didn't need to. He understood what I was going through, maybe even better than I did. He was the one who'd had to sit in a room with FBI agents and talk about his own father. He was the one who'd had to choose between loyalty and truth, and he'd chosen truth. I was just following his lead. The next week was a blur of phone calls and documents and legal meetings. The federal prosecutors wanted to meet with me in person. They came to my house on a Saturday afternoon, 2 agents, a woman named Sarah Chen and a man named Rodriguez, both wearing the particular expression of people who'd seen too much wrongdoing to be surprised by anything. They set up a laptop on my kitchen table, and they walked me through the timeline. They showed me documents with Marcus's signature. They showed me emails where he'd discussed strategies for maintaining price points while managing public perception. They showed me bank statements that tracked money from Meridian Holdings to accounts in Marcus's name to offshore accounts I'd never heard of. Your ex-husband was very careful, Sarah told me. He used multiple shell companies, multiple layers of concealment, but he made one mistake. He used the same email address across all of them. That's how we caught him. I looked at the email address on the screen, marcus.coleman.consulting@meridianholdings.net, and I realized I'd never seen it before. I'd never known it existed, which meant that the Marcus I'd been married to had a whole life I'd never been part of, a whole identity that was completely separate from the one he'd shown me. How long had he been doing this? I asked. Best estimate? Since about 6 months before you got married, Rodriguez said. So roughly 16 years. 16 years. Our entire marriage had been built on fraud. Every house we'd lived in, every vacation we'd taken, every dollar he'd spent on the kids. It was all money that had been stolen from people who were trying to stay alive. The trial was scheduled for the following March. That gave us 4 months. 4 months of my children hating me, or pitying me, or trying to understand how I could have married someone like this. 4 months of journalists calling, of neighbors whispering, of trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a life that had been completely upended. Nisha eventually came around. She didn't apologize for hanging up on me, but she also stopped being angry at me. Instead, she was angry at her father, which was appropriate and healthy and terrible to witness. Brandon threw himself into his studies, which was his way of processing trauma. I went to work every day and did my job and came home and made dinner and pretended that my life hadn't shattered into a million pieces. But underneath it all, I was preparing. I was gathering documents, reviewing my testimony, working with the prosecutors to make sure my timeline was airtight. I was building the case against the man I'd once loved. And in some strange way, it felt like the most important work I'd ever done. The week before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I was sitting on my couch at 3 a.m, drinking cold coffee and staring at nothing, when I realized something. The air freshener was still hanging from my mirror. I'd never taken it down. Brandon had bought it months ago, before any of this happened, and it had just stayed there, a small reminder of a simpler time. But it wasn't simple anymore. Nothing was simple anymore. I got up and I went out to the garage, and I got the car and I drove it to a car wash. I sat in the waiting area and I watched the machines spray water and soap and chemicals, and I thought about how you can wash the outside of something until it gleams, but you can't clean away what's underneath. You can't scrub away the truth. When the car was clean, I drove straight to the courthouse. It was closed, of course. It was 3 a.m, but I sat in the parking lot and I looked at the building and I thought about what was going to happen in there in just a few days. I thought about Marcus sitting at the defendant's table. I thought about me sitting in the witness box. I thought about the moment when I would look him in the eye and tell the truth, whatever that truth cost. And I realized something else. I realized that I wasn't afraid anymore. I was past fear. I was past anger. I was in that cold, clear place where you understand that some things have to be done, and you're the only one who can do them, and that's enough. I went home and I took a shower and I got dressed for work, even though it was only 4 a.m. I made a pot of coffee and I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and I scrolled through the photos I had on my phone. Photos of Marcus and me from our wedding day. Photos of him holding Brandon when he was newborn. Photos of him teaching Nisha to ride a bike. All of those moments still happened. All of that love still existed. But it existed alongside something else now. It existed alongside the truth. When the trial started, I was ready. I walked into the courthouse on a Monday morning in March, and I was wearing the same cream-colored sweater I'd worn the day Derek Paulson had pulled me over. It felt symbolic, though maybe it was just practical. It made me feel confident. I sat in the witness room with the prosecutors, and I reviewed my testimony one more time, and then I was called to the stand. The courtroom was full. There were journalists in the back, federal agents in the middle rows, and Marcus at the defendant's table. He was wearing a suit, and his hair was graying at the temples in a way I'd never noticed before, and when he saw me, he looked away. He couldn't meet my eyes. That told me everything I needed to know. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh, took me through my testimony methodically. She asked me about the divorce, about the financial discovery, about the documents I'd found. She asked me about conversations I'd overheard, about the way Marcus had structured his income, about the Meridian Holdings credit card bill that Brandon had seen. And I answered every question truthfully, calmly, without emotion. I was a witness. My job was to present facts, not feelings. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. He was an older man named Patterson, the kind of lawyer who'd probably defended white-collar criminals his entire career. He tried to suggest that I was biased because of the divorce, that I might have misinterpreted things I'd seen, that my testimony was colored by personal animus. "Ms. Coleman," he said, approaching the witness stand, "isn't it true that you and your ex-husband had a contentious divorce? That you felt he was withholding money from you?" "We had a divorce," I said. "It was resolved 6 years ago. I was satisfied with the settlement." "But you must have felt angry about it, about the fact that he had money and you didn't?" I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the years of building a new life, the years of stability and peace. I thought about the people who'd bought those drugs at inflated prices, the people who'd had to choose between medication and rent, the people who'd died because they couldn't afford the treatment they needed. "I felt," I said carefully, "that he should be honest about where his money came from. And when I found out he hadn't been, I felt that I had an obligation to tell the truth. I still feel that way." Patterson tried a few more angles, but I didn't budge. I'd prepared for this. I knew what he was going to ask before he asked it, and I knew exactly how I was going to answer. By the time I was dismissed from the stand, he looked frustrated, and I knew I'd done what I came to do. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, Marcus was convicted on 17 counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later, and the judge gave him 12 years in federal prison. 12 years. The number hung in the air like a sentence, and in a way, it was. I didn't go to the sentencing hearing. I didn't need to. I'd said what I came to say. But Brandon and Nisha both went. They sat in the courtroom, and they watched their father be taken away. And afterward, they met me at home, and we sat together in the living room, and we didn't say much of anything. What was there to say? We'd survived. We'd told the truth. And now we had to figure out how to live with the aftermath. The air freshener finally fell off my mirror about a month later. I was driving to work and I hit a bump, and it tumbled down and landed in the passenger seat, and I just left it there for the rest of the drive. When I got to work, I picked it up and I smelled it. That same fake pine scent that Brandon had bought so long ago, trying to fix something that wasn't broken. And I realized that I didn't need it anymore. The car didn't smell like old coffee and regret. It smelled like freedom. That evening, I drove to the coast. I parked my car at a lookout point, and I walked to the edge of the cliff, and I looked out at the ocean, and I thought about everything that had happened. The traffic stop that wasn't really about an air freshener. The discovery that the man I'd married was a criminal. The choice I'd made to tell the truth. The cost of that truth. And I realized that I'd been given a gift, even though it had come wrapped in pain. I'd been given clarity. I'd been given the knowledge that I was strong enough to do the hard thing. I'd been given a second chance. I threw the air freshener off the cliff, watched it tumble through the air and disappear into the rocks below. And I turned around, and I walked back to my car, and I drove home to my children, and I thought about the future. Not the future I'd expected, but the one I'd earned.